thank you so much for inviting me, and for joining in this pre-conversation. I suppose what I'll be talking about is a preview to a deeper dive version of what I'll be discussing, and hopefully we'll all be discussing together at the ebbf conference in May. But in terms of definitions of success, let me maybe share with you first how and why I define what I do, and what kind of success we look for at the Tahirih Justice Center. And then I'll share with you some of the things I'm questioning about that, basically. Success for our work, what we do, we're a nonprofit organization. So for us, there's no rational relationship between our product and profit. I'll talk a little bit more about that, because that creates an engineered problem for success for a lot of nonprofits, but we'll just hold that over there for a minute. But in terms of success in what we do, we are a nonprofit organization. We have to fundraise. Our annual budget is about $15 million annually. We have 112 full-time staff. We're in 5 offices around the United States. What we do as an organization is that we provide for justice for women and girls who are fleeing human rights abuses. So our clients are fleeing things like female genital mutilation, human trafficking, rape, domestic violence, child marriage, honor violence, things like that. So our clients are facing these forms of violence, which are simply symptoms of underlying lack of equality of women and men in the world. In order to change their lives, to be free from violence, in order to change their own communities, the trajectory generationally of their families, to change their cultures, they need legal protection in the moment of their courage. So these are women with incredible intelligence, incredible power, incredible agency. However, their lives are in danger. And so in order to kind of surround them with justice so that they can be protected as they seek to change their families, their culture, their own lives, they need a lawyer. And there's a paradigm in the United States in particular where it's nearly impossible to access justice without a lawyer. Unfortunately, all of the legal protections available to women and girls fleeing violence are very complex legal remedies, and our process in the US for accessing those legal remedies, although they're humanitarian remedies, it's an adversarial legal process. So at the Tahirih Justice Center, our objective, our mission, is to provide free legal defense and also to change the law. We do advocacy, legislative drafting, impact litigation to change legal precedent. So we're developing the law itself, but then we're also accessing the law for immigrant women and girls who are fleeing human rights abuses. The volume of the work, I mentioned earlier that we've got over 100 full-time staff. We're litigating around 2,000 cases at any given time. And in doing that work, we manage 2,700 pro bono attorneys. These are all lawyers that work at Visa Corporation, Chanel, General Electric, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. So they're in-house counsel at these large companies, as well as maybe they are attorneys at large law firms. I used to be at a large firm called Arnold and Porter, firms like that, basically. So we partner our over 100 staff. Their work is multiplied by the army of volunteer lawyers that we have behind us, which allows each of our attorneys to handle approximately 4 times the amount of cases that they would be able to handle by themselves. So that's the machinery that we use in order to provide for legal defense for immigrant women and girls. So how do we define success? There are 2 spheres in which we look at success. One is on an institutional level, and then one is at a programmatic level. On the programmatic level, hopefully, obviously, we look at our success rate in the cases that we litigate. We want to win. People come to us to receive justice. They come to us to receive legal protection. And an easy measure is, did they receive that legal protection? There are other indicators that we use to measure success, including the experience of the client. Did they experience dignity? Did they experience empowerment? Did they experience safety, efficiency, respect, linguistically competent representation, culturally competent representation? And then we have several ways that we measure that, including client satisfaction surveys, peer surveys, interviews, qualitative interviews, things of that nature. So successes on the programmatic side is determined by whether we're winning the cases that we're litigating and then what our clients' experiences are. Because pro bono attorneys, volunteer attorneys who work at large corporations and law firms, are an important stakeholder group, we also care about their experience with us. Were they adequately mentored and trained? Were we responsive? Did they get the information that they need, the support that they need, that kind of thing? So we have success measures that look at those elements of our programmatic work. Then there's the institutional side, and we have measures of success on the institutional side of what Tahirih does. On the institutional side, we look at our management capacity. We look at retention levels of our staff. We look at whether we're adhering as an organization to our values. The Tahirih Justice Center is a transparently Baha'i-inspired organization. All of our staff, and by the way, out of our 117 full-time staff, only 6 are actually Baha'is. So being Baha'i-inspired for us is not dependent on people holding Baha'i values personally. It's a cultural value, it's an institutional value. And so there's a rather elaborate process for hiring people to align with those values, orienting them to align with those values, and then reinforcing through professional development, training, annual evaluations, regular feedback, and that kind of thing, to make sure that those values are being adhered to. Some of those values include consultation as a tool of decision making, being nonpartisan, not engaging in backbiting, excellence. Anyway, there's a whole document that lays out 14 different values that are all rooted in the Baha'i faith that we measure and assess our staff against, as well as the organization as a whole. And so success looks like not just the work at the end of the day from a programmatic perspective, but it also looks like how we exercise our work, how we execute our work. And with regard to the nonprofit management side of things, one of the challenges, so now I'm going to shift. I just did like kind of overview explanation of how we look at success from a programmatic mission perspective, and then how we look at success from an institutional management perspective. I'm going to shift now in the last 5 minutes to talk about some of the challenges, some of the quandaries we're having, some of the questions that we have in those measures of success. On the management side of things, one of the quandaries that exist in the nonprofit sector is the fact that there is not a rational cause and effect direct correlation between money revenue coming in and the quality of the work going out. The connection absolutely is not there. So, for example, in the for-profit sector, if you make cars that are good, people will buy them. So there's a direct correlation between revenue generation and the quality of the product. In the nonprofit sector, whether or not how good our legal services are for the women and girls we serve fleeing human rights abuses, our donors will never know. They'll never know the truth of what the experience is of our client, because the way the nonprofit sector works is there isn't a direct correlation, a cause and effect correlation between the product and the revenue. The correlation between the revenue and whether the nonprofit receives it is the story they tell and how good it is. So it's a measure of their PR, first and foremost. It's a measure of their grant writing abilities. It's a measure of how important and well connected their board members are and whether they're able to gain credibility by their peers. And so when they tell them this is a great nonprofit, they then believe it's a great nonprofit. It's a game of PR and portrayal and storytelling, and it's not accurate and it's not fair, and it bugs me a lot in terms of the nonprofit sector and the way it works. I have regular meetings with donors. I had actually a meeting last week with a donor, and I was telling her the stories of our clients, which of course moved her and inspired her. And then I said to her, and would you like to know the ROI on the work we do? Because we measure it. We actually really care. How many hours does this kind of case take? Is it more efficient with more paralegals, less pro bono attorneys, more in-house attorneys? What is the most efficient staffing for a particular type of case? We measure that at Tahirih, but nobody cares. I keep trying to get donors to want to know about the way we measure return on investment, which to us is a measure of success. We could be super efficient in the way we do our work. We happen to have a 99% success rate in the cases we litigate. We have high marks for client satisfaction. But every time I try to hand that data to our donors, they kind of sit back and say, yeah, I'm actually not really interested in that. I just want to know the stories, the kind of heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, emotional stories of your clients. And I want to know your annual metrics at the end of the day. But these deep dive measures of success, I'm not really interested in. So it's a quandary in the nonprofit sector that I think has to be confronted. Because frankly, I think it leads to some nonprofits caring more and putting more resources for reasons that are logical, given the rational relationship to the fact that the degree to which your PR is good, you'll get more money. But that detracts from the actual quality of the work, which has a more of a direct relationship in the for-profit sector, because the person giving you the revenue is the one experiencing your product, experiencing your services. So that's a quandary in the nonprofit sector, and something that we talk about at Tahirih, and we kind of deliberately choose to ignore sometimes, believing that measuring success by our efficiency and some of these other measures that many of our donors don't ask about and don't seem to care about is something that we have to do anyway. Another quandary or question, so I've kind of divided success into the institutional success and the mission success. So another quandary or challenge that we have on success that is on the mission programmatic side is a question about what is justice. So in American culture, having a good lawyer and winning means that you have gained over another. That's like the definition of justice. That you have maybe won civil damages, maybe you've gotten punitive damages, you've won money by the end of the litigation, or that you've succeeded in putting somebody in jail. So there's either a punitive measure of success or a resource measure of success, money damages, that kind of thing. So in the legal system, justice is defined by what you get out of it or how much you can punish out of it. The Baha'i writings say that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity. So unity usually isn't in there. Like when lawyers are litigating, when there is an exercise in achieving justice for your client, unity is usually not one of the measures of success. But in the Baha'i writings, we're told that unity is actually the end result. It's the purpose. It's kind of the so what of why we have justice to begin with. And so we've been thinking a lot about that lately. And there is a movement which has been led, in fact, by the Christian church called restorative justice. And I think it's very aligned with Baha'i values, because it's this idea that justice is not complete until there's been restoration of the relationship between the wronged and the wrongdoer, and restitution in the harm that's been done. And so there's a restorative objective that looks more like unity, frankly, than our traditional legal system, where if you've made someone suffer, that's what justice looks like. In a Baha'i context, consequence, punishment, is a part of justice. But then we have this quotation: the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men. And so, and by the way, that word appearance in English, that word can mean two things. It can mean facade, like it's just going to look like it is. It has another meaning, though, which means the emergence of something. I don't speak the language that this particular quote was written in, but a friend of mine does, and told me that it's the same word. The word appearance in this quotation is the same word used to describe the rising of the sun. And so in this quotation then is saying that the purpose of justice is the emergence, the appearance of unity. So at the end of the day, it seems to me that justice, and whether we've achieved it, whether we're good at it, should be measured by unity. Unfortunately, too many people stop at the punishment part, or they stop at the "I won in court and now I've got your money" part. And the restoration part of the relationship, or the injustice that gave rise to the litigation to begin with, is not addressed. There's another Baha'i quotation that's been guiding our thinking around this, which is that love cannot dwell in a heart possessed by fear. And so when you put that quote together, along with the other quotation that says the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity, it makes a whole lot of sense. Because when there's injustice, you are in great fear. Our clients who are suffering domestic violence, rape, female genital mutilation, human trafficking, it's very hard to find love, which is necessary for unity, in a state of fear. But when you receive justice and protection, and when fear is lifted, then love can enter the heart, and then unity, which, as we know, is really the end success measure of justice, feels more possible. Now, there are people, amazing people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Abdul Baha and others who've managed to find love in their heart, even under the yoke of injustice. But it sure is easier when you are free from fear and you feel that you're in a situation of justice. So that's the 17-minute version of what I'll be diving into in a more deeper sense at the ebbf conference. But I'm going to be obedient to the moderator's rules and stop here and invite questions or comments.
I wrote a couple of questions because you mentioned a lot of metrics, and I really like that approach. I used to work for Mozilla, which is an open source nonprofit organization as well. And we in the open innovation team, we were dealing a lot with metrics, measuring impact of open source and so on. And what you mentioned, like measuring dignity during a process or measuring unity, I would like to hear a little more about that. How do you measure these kind of things?
How do you measure unity or freedom from fear? That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, you know, I think, well, let me give you one example, actually. So we had a client who was a victim of forced and child marriage. So she was 16 years old. Her family decided that she had become too Americanized. Her behavior was dishonoring the family and causing shame. They decided to arrange for her to marry her first cousin, who was 47 years old and lived back in her home country, which was in the Middle East. The family told her, "We are going to force you to marry this man." She said, "No, I don't want to marry him." And they beat her. They withheld food from her. They chained her to her bed 2 days a week because they figured that the public school system in Virginia, which is where she was living, they learned that Child Protective Services would not intervene if a child was appearing in school at least 3 days a week regularly, but they would intervene. There's a trigger where they get involved if they're missing more school. So they would deliberately keep her out of school and chain to her bed 2 days a week. And then she would only be allowed to come to school 3 days a week. The wedding was being planned, but she didn't know exactly the date. And so she was living in a state of fear and was trying to resist this marriage. Her teachers noticed that she went from a straight A student to not receiving good grades. She had become withdrawn. Physically, she was looking really different. They expressed concern. They talked to her, and she confided in them that her parents were trying to marry her to this first cousin, and that she had a cousin who had been beheaded for her refusal to marry the man that the family wanted. So this was a life and death thing for her, and she was really in great danger. The principal of the school, the counselor called the principal called us. We went into the school, we met with her, we worked out a safety plan for her. We let her know the consequences of leaving her family. She had to understand the severity of what it would take to protect her and the implications. Long story short, she heard her mother on the phone and heard that the wedding was planned for that weekend. She knew she would be taken to the airport soon. Our safety plan with her had her, she'd already packed a bag with her her documents and left it at school so that everything was safe at the school. When she went to school the next day, she called us. We picked her up during lunch and we headed immediately into court. And we petitioned the court. They gave us custody of her, and she went underground. She got off social media and she completely went dark to her family. She disappeared, from her family's perspective. What happened was, and she was pulled out of school for 3 months during all of this time in order to protect her. What happened was her family hired a lawyer, not, completely understandably, and the lawyer fought the public system's protection of her. They asked to meet with their daughter. They said, we love her. We don't want this disunity in the family. We don't want the shame in the family. We've lost a lot of money. The wedding weekend came and went, and we need to talk to her. We made sure that our lawyer was there who speaks fluent Arabic so that they really understood what was being said between the parents. And the first meeting went something like, all is forgiven. We love you. Don't worry about anything. Please come home. We knew that wasn't accurate in terms of the emotion of the family, and they weren't allowed access. The second meeting, which was more emotionally accurate, was we hate you. We disown you. You've shamed the family. We hope you commit suicide and never come back. That was the second meeting. Then the third meeting was something in the middle. Anyway, there were 6 meetings altogether with her. And the state, meanwhile, was prosecuting the family for child endangerment and all of these kinds of things. The end result was that she was reunified with her family. She actually loved her family, and her parents actually loved her. She missed her siblings, but we retained her passport. The court required that she not leave a certain physical jurisdiction. They checked in with her monthly. There were all of these protective boundary mechanisms put in place. But so what justice looked like in that case was a transformation of behavior of the family and ultimate unity and restoration of the family. Others might have argued that the family being in jail for 10 years is what justice should have been. And there's an argument that could be made about that. But in this example, what justice looked like for our client was in fact a restoration of the relationship and an actual change of the behavior. So as a result of our client standing up, her sister, who had also been promised to a man, no longer had to marry him. So there was a change of behavior in the culture of the family. So when you say, how do you measure success? I mean, that might be one way to look at success as not just defined by punitive result in a justice system or monetary gain in a justice system.
The question, how do you measure things like unity? We have actually had high-inspired research projects with EU funding to develop values-based indicators of things like unity and diversity, trustworthiness, justice, empowerment, integrity, care for the environment. So there is some experience and some, methods out there to measure these sort of intangible things, and they've been quite successful. Used by the Red Cross and educational programs and so on. So there are some tools to respond to that concern of Henrik's. My particular question, given your experience in the nonprofit sector doing things that aren't easily measured by the standard measures of basically money measures, how might you generalize that challenge to the larger challenge of assessing work as service rather than work as simply wealth creation? We should be creating employment for everybody. Yet many things need to be done, but they're not seen as something worth paying for in the present material system. And so we have to say, how do we rethink the measures, whether it be the justice you're delivering or work as service? And do you have any ideas or thinking along those lines as one of the big challenges that we face in building a new economic system?
Well, I think, one of the blessings, I guess, that we have is no one expects us to measure our success in wealth generation or profitability, because our work is to protect women and girls from violence. And so, our funders, our grantors, the foundations that look at our metrics, government agencies that look at our metrics, the kinds of things that we are measured against are how many we can serve, what our success rate is in our litigation. I think I saw another question there about how do you measure experiencing dignity. We measure that through our clients. They do satisfaction surveys. We do qualitative interviews with them when their services are complete to ask about their experience with us. Did they receive linguistically competent service? Did they feel respected? Were we responsive? We have an internal rule about responding to clients within 36 hours. Did they receive that standard of responsiveness? I mean, there are measures. They're kind of easy, frankly, measures to make sure that they had a good client experience. And then, our donors measure us against our impact and our outputs of the legal representation, social services, public policy advocacy that we engage in. So nobody's expecting us to make money or generate wealth from our work. So it's somewhere in the middle. It's not completely free and it's not with strings attached either. It is with expectation, justifiable and right expectation. So, when donors give us money, they trust that we'll do what we say we're going to do with the money. And that's fair, that's accurate, and that's a standard that we should be held accountable for. And so there's no problem with that. I mean, when we write a proposal, we say we're going to serve 4,000 women and girls this year. We're going to bring X number of human trafficking cases, X number of asylum cases. We're going to maintain a 95% success rate in the cases we litigate, et cetera. And then at the end of the year, we then report against those measures. And I'm doing an injustice to describing. We have a really detailed annual goal setting process that we measure ourselves against on a quarterly basis. We have a dashboard that's quite elaborate. Anyway, so there are a lot of measures that we use, and we have systems for the regular accounting and assessment of our success against those measures. And so funders want to see that. We promise that to funders, and they want to see, have we accomplished what we say we're going to do? We have and will refuse money from donors who want to personally control the work. And that's okay. I mean, I think, our work is guided based on what our clients need, what is best practice in our field, what is most effective in providing legal services. And donors who give us money should give us money because success to them looks like how we're defining success. It does happen sometimes that we have a donor who's defining success in really different ways that deviate from what we think is in fact effective. And we'll have an open conversation with them. One silly, I think, example is we had a donor who wanted to give us money in order to ensure that all of our human trafficking victims who were teenagers had prom dresses. For some reason, for that donor, her definition of success looked like fancy dresses for human trafficking victims. That is not what success looks like at Tahirih. Our clients really don't care about prom dresses, and we were unwilling to accept her money and meet her definition of success. And so we just had to have a long conversation with her that said, we're happy to accept your $10,000, but we're not going to be buying prom dresses with it. What we're going to be doing is providing social services, legal services for human trafficking victims. She chose to take her money somewhere else where they would buy prom dresses. And that's fine. That's her prerogative. So, people have intention around their money, but we won't do what they want simply because they're about to give us money for it. We do what we do, how we do it, because it's effective and it ultimately protects women and girls from violence. That's our measure at the end of the day.
Another question that was asked also by Henrik, but it's actually a question that most people ask at the ebbf is, how do you onboard people and make sure they understand, live by, and then actually act with the values that you have in mind there? I think you mentioned 14 values, which sounds like an awful lot of values. So what is your success rate, or how do you successfully onboard people?
Yeah, this is such a great question, because it's almost the most important thing we do, I think, from an institutional perspective. Once the right people are lined up, it flows much easier in terms of the execution of the work. So hiring is step number one. And I think that there are ways to control who applies for the job. So on our website, we're very transparent about being Baha'i inspired. I think there's actually more we can do in laying out the detail of what that looks like at Tahirih, or what that means practically. But there is nobody who applies to Tahirih who, at least if they've looked at our website at all and looked at our hiring page, they know that we're Baha'i inspired. And so that should not be a secret to anyone. And to the degree to which that is not okay for somebody, we want to stop them before they reach the gate. You know what I mean? Like, if that's a concern at all, we don't even want their applications. So we try to be very. Then when somebody applies, there is, there's an interview process that is consultative based. So they meet with the manager, they meet with the team consults on candidates and decides, and then offers are made. In the interview process, we have stock questions that everyone has to ask. They can ask a lot of different questions, but among them are values. And, there are questions, as many of you know, that are very direct, that people can kind of say yes or no to, but it doesn't really get at how they execute the values. And then there are other questions that get at how they might execute the values. So for example, in the interview, we will bring up the fact that we're a nonpartisan organization. That's particularly important for us because we work in public policy advocacy. We work on human rights issues. We work in a time where our issues, which were not politicized before, are currently being politicized. So it takes extra rigor and kind of extra mindfulness around that. And we have hour-long conversations with candidates around what that looks like. Tactically, tangibly, we will say things to them like, are you able to meet with somebody who you disagree with on a whole lot of other issues to find commonality on certain issues? And to be really honest, a lot of social justice advocates right now in the United States are not willing to do that. So the fact that we meet with this current White House on issues that they're willing to talk to us about is offensive to some people in the human rights community. And so we have to flush that out for people who are thinking of working at Tahirih. We ask them about their experience with disunity in offices where there might be conflicts, where there were problems. We ask how they responded in those instances, what their role was. We look to whether they backbite, whether they triangulate. We look to whether they confront power, whether they can talk directly, whether they can, whether they're conflict avoidant, or whether they bring issues up directly. that gets at our values of consultation, our values of unity, not backbiting. Anyway, those are just a few examples, but in the interview process, there's a lot of interview questions that try to get at how they value things and whether that aligns with our values. Then when everyone starts at Tahirih, they go through a 4-day, all-day orientation. And I would say half of it is orienting them on our values. We do a really deep dive training on what consultation looks like and how to execute it. We do a lot of training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We do training on what does being Baha'i inspired mean and what is the Baha'i faith. Not everyone, as I mentioned, only 6 people out of an organization of 117 staff are Baha'is, but everyone at Tahirih must know the 101. And that's simply because it's such a foreign name, a foreign word to so many people. And early on in our history, people mistakenly believed that Tahirih was our prophet. And we were like, wait, no, we actually you have to have the 101. If you're working for a Baha'i inspired organization, you at least have got to know about who the prophet is and what our basic tenets are. So everyone gets that. They get the history. We do a very deep dive. We do a deepening on our values. What I mean by that is we have a compilation of Baha'i quotations about each of our values. Everyone has to read them. We do a style, which is it's called a Ruhi style, where we basically go around and everyone talks about what it means to them and how they would apply it. Everybody in the organization has to do that. So orientation, hiring, then the reinforcing of the values. We do formal 360 evaluations every year. People are evaluated on the quality of their work, and they're evaluated on the adherence to core values. And so people are assessed on how nonpartisan they are, how consultative they are, how unifying, how appreciative of diversity and inclusion and equity they are. So people are evaluated on that. There's also an ethic that we live and we model, which is that you don't get fired at Tahirih for not having the best skills. Hopefully you are good at what you do, but if you need development on certain skills, certain expertise, we will work with you. We'll pay for professional development. Many of our people are working with executive coaches. Like, there's a lot that we'll do to help people grow. If there is a flagrant violation of our values, people get fired quickly for that. And part of that is that I can't, we're not therapists. I used to think I could transform people on their values. And I learned the hard way that I really can't. You kind of learned to share and not retaliate when somebody takes your toy in the sandbox when you were 4 years old, or you didn't. You learned how to share your ideas and consult at some point when you were developing your values, or you didn't. And we can't shift values in our staff, is what we've learned. So we try to hire for it, we try to orient it, but when we've gotten it wrong, we will ask somebody to leave, letting them know that it's not a good fit. And we're a mission-based organization, and this is not uncommon for mission-based organizations. Even for for-profit organizations, Chick-fil-A, others are very clear on their values, and if you don't align, it's time to leave. So we reinforce and enforce the values.
ebbf and Women Institute is preparing a course now called Consultation in Business. And okay, I had one question, and I quote Abdul Baha, that they must, when coming together, turn their faces to the kingdom on high and ask aid from the realm of glory. All of the other aspects of consultation, I think is very straightforward and can be used in a non-Baha'i context, because there's lots of non-Baha'is working with you. How do you approach the more spiritual aspects? Because we do believe that consultation does have a spiritual element that's very much part of the, let's say, the ability to come to the right decisions and to find unity within the group. How do you deal with that?
One of the things that we do, and obviously it's not the same thing, but we do have moments of mindfulness. So at the beginning of our board meeting, for example, we have an inspiration, is what we call it. Every meeting begins with an inspiration. If a Baha'i happens to be doing the inspiration, 10 times out of 10, they say a Baha'i prayer. If it's somebody who's not a Baha'i, their inspiration can be a poem. Sometimes it's a verse from the Bible. but the point is to lift up. And the point is to center ourselves around that which is higher than any of the egos in the room, any of the opinions in the room, any of us in the room. So we have a practice that does that, but you know, clearly it's not doing exactly what Abdul Baha is suggesting we do in the context of Baha'i consultation. And there's a lot we're not getting right. I mean, I think we're learning all the time. Consultation, we actually it's ironic because just this morning we had our national support team, which is made up of all the C-levels in the organization. The biggest topic for consultation at this meeting was consultation and how to model it for staff, how to disseminate it. Also within a framework of social justice. So many of the people who come to Tahirih, who work at Tahirih, are from marginalized communities. Many have experienced violence. Many have experienced racism, sexism, oppression of different forms. People come to this work because they, you know, we have stories around why we care about this work. Within that frame of distrust, how do you consult? And it's very complicated because, you know, this idea, for example, which may be intuitive to people who've been consulting our lives. I had an idea and I hand the idea to the group. I put my idea out, I put it in the middle of the table, and then I back away from it and everyone responds to it, but it's not personal to me. To some others, feels like their idea has been colonized. It has been stolen from them. It has been appropriated, and it has been used. And there's a feeling of disgruntledness around the idea that you can take my idea and change it, and rename it, and use it. And so, you know, we're having to do work that's like, you know, communication skills, ego disassociation, collective interest, unity in the whole being more important than individual primacy. It's hard. Consultation is hard. So I don't want to sugarcoat that. We have a moment of mindfulness. Does that solve everything? Absolutely not. Do you ever raise spiritual qualities in your legal interactions, court policy work, etc.? If so, how is that received? Yes, we do. So I mentioned earlier that all staff at Tahirih have to deepen on Baha'i writings that relate to our values. In one of the deepenings that we were having, we were reflecting on the quotation that says, "The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity." We were also reflecting on the Baha'i quotation that says that oneness is the pivot round which all of the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolve. One of our staff, who's actually atheist, one of our staff said, you know, what this says to me is we have to completely reframe what we do. And I was like, what do you mean? And she says, well, the way we're framing what we do right now is about ending violence against women. That's kind of how we frame what we do. And she said, I actually think we need to completely reframe it to oneness. It needs to all be about oneness. And ending violence against women is really only one of the building blocks to oneness, to, you know, unity and humanity. And so we brought in our communications team, our media team, our PR team, our legal advocacy team, our public policy advocacy team. And we had this big conversation around, you know, if we reframe our theory of change around oneness and unity being our ultimate objective, and then equality of women and men, ending violence against women and girls, justice being building blocks to unity, you know, what's that going to look like and all? And so everyone kind of went back to their own spheres and reframed everything in terms of oneness. So, for example, we just did an interview yesterday with Teen Vogue magazine about the border, what's happening with the separation of women and children at the border. And my talking point, my first talking point was, this is a reflection of the lack of the oneness of humanity, and that we can disassociate our empathy and our sympathy from other people. Like, we're framing it all around oneness. So it's a spiritual, that's a spiritual principle. That's a spiritual quality. And we are very intentional about how can we apply that spiritual principle or quality to our work. We had recently another interview where somebody was trying to kind of say the problem with this certain policy is this political party or this political process. And our talking point was, no, it's a spiritual disease. The real problem isn't the partisan politics. The real problem is our spiritual orientation around our lack of oneness. And then kind of move to that talking point around seeing each other as one. I was in LA last week, gave a speech, again, reframed it completely based on our new, refined, hopefully improved application of this. And again, spent most of my time talking to that audience about oneness, the golden rule, which exists in all faiths, and how are we really applying that in our immigration policies and our policies around women and ending violence against women, that kind of thing. Also consultation, we talk about that. It's a spiritual principle. We may not invoke the word spiritual. We know it comes from a spiritual place, but we'll talk about consultation. So we bring in spiritual principles to all of our work all of the time. And then sometimes we name it as spiritual. We don't shy away from that. You know, people are hungry for inspiration, actually. People are hungry to be elevated out of the drudgery of the tactical. And we don't find resistance to lifting people into conversations that become esoteric, philosophical, or spiritual. Also, in terms of being a Baha'i-inspired nonprofit organization, you know, we have no problem raising money from major corporations, large foundations, and government agencies. They appreciate transparency around your values. What's more problematic is if they think that you are not values-based, or if they feel like you're hiding, that you've got like ties and affiliations and you're not being overt or clear about what those are. And so we have found it more advantageous than not to be very upfront and clear about those things.
I work with a lot of leaders. I actually do a lot of leadership design assessment with different organizations, and I would love to hear your thoughts on just being the founder of this inspiring organization for so many years and working with so many different people with so many diverse backgrounds and capacities. What do you see as, I guess it's two-part, like the role of leadership as well as how can different, how can we support diversity and capacity building in terms of how leaders are able to keep that unity and that oneness?
I mean, it's hard. There's a lot of challenge. And then, you know, I'm not sure globally what the temperature is, but in the United States, particularly in the social justice sector, there is, I'm trying to find the right descriptor for the emotion, but there's just anger. There's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration, a lot of impatience with people in power, white people, men. You can fill in the blanks into, you know, a kind of traditional sources and demographics of power. And that anger and that impatience is well-informed. It's completely justified. And those of us who are in those spaces, even with good intentions, are screwing up, are, you know, continuing to perpetuate racism and sexism and processes of privilege and oppression and these kinds of things. And it's a time for self-examination, and it's a time for reflection. And I've personally been doing a lot of reflection. We've talked a lot about at Tahirih, you know, what systems and structures have we inherited that are patriarchal? Why does our org chart look like this? Like, is there any reason it has to look like that? You know, are there other ways that are more inclusive, less rooted in traditional power norms? What are ways of working that are perpetuating, for example, racism? You know, we have staff who have different ways of communicating. We have staff who have different histories. that might cause them to talk to somebody who looks like somebody else in a very different way, in a deferential way, or in a dominant way. And are we unpacking what's really happening? We're doing a lot of deep dive work on that. And so as a leader, well, I mean, I think we all know that leaders' jobs at the end of the day are to enable other people to do their job. It's a supportive role. And so my job is to make sure people in the organization have the resources they need, have the support they need, and are able to execute their work. And I have been feeling old lately, to be really honest. And I have been feeling out of date with regard to some current concepts and understandings. And I have been reading like crazy. I have been, there are a lot of podcasts. I highly recommend the podcast called Seeing White. It's incredibly important to understand, books like White Fragility, Decolonizing Wealth, Winners Take All, 1916. Right now I'm reading a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. They're books I've read recently around gender constructs, making sure I'm better informed around some of those issues. I'm learning a lot and on hyperspeed in order to stay relevant and to stay of service, because some of the ways I'm used to talking about things that I began 20 something years ago are out of date with current thinking. And so anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but as a leader, I've found it really important for me to try to be in learning mode a lot, particularly I'd say in the last 2 years. So let's see. Oh yeah, that is the podcast, Seeing White, seen on radio. There's so many, there's a Baha'i actually, Joy DeGruy, who wrote the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And, in the non-Baha'i world, she's a goddess. She's so influential and so important. And I find that most Baha'is don't even read her stuff. But in the social justice world, she's it. And her book also is really important, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, The New Jim Crow, The Age of Mass Incarceration, and Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. That's another really important book. There's so many, but times are intense right now.